The morning sun cast long shadows across the cobblestones of Prague as Master Johann Kellner hurried through the narrow streets toward the castle. In his leather satchel, he carried documents that would change everything he thought he knew about power, about rulers, and about the very nature of those who claimed dominion over the world of men. It was the year 1648, and Johann had spent his life serving as a scribe in the court of Emperor Ferdinand III. He believed, as did most mortals, that kings ruled by divine right, that their bloodlines carried the sacred mandate of heaven itself. He was about to discover how catastrophically wrong he had been. The summons had come at dawn, delivered by a pale messenger whose eyes seemed to reflect light like polished silver. Johann was to transcribe a meeting between his emperor and certain foreign dignitaries. Nothing unusual in that, except for the hour. The meeting would begin before sunrise and conclude before the first light touched the castle walls. As Johann approached the designated chamber, he heard voices speaking in languages that predated Latin, words that seemed to twist in the air and make his teeth ache. He paused outside the heavy oak door, his hand trembling as he reached for the handle. Through a crack in the doorframe, he glimpsed something that froze his blood. Emperor Ferdinand III, the man Johann had served faithfully for 15 years, sat at the head of a long table. But this was not the emperor Johann knew. The Habsburg jaw remained, the imperial bearing was intact, but the skin held a translucent quality that revealed dark veins beneath. Most disturbing of all were the eyes, completely black, without iris or pupil, like looking into twin abysses. Around the table sat others who wore the faces of European nobility, yet each displayed the same inhuman characteristics. The Duke of Bavaria's skin rippled occasionally, as if something moved beneath it. The representative from Venice had fingers that ended not in nails, but in what appeared to be small, sharp talons. A woman who bore the seal of the French court had hair that moved without any breeze, each strand seeming to possess its own sinuous life. The humans grow restless, the emperor was saying, his voice carrying harmonics that human vocal cords could never produce. The Protestant Reformation has made them question authority. They begin to think for themselves. The Venetian representative leaned forward, his taloned fingers drumming against the wooden table. Perhaps it is time to end the masquerade entirely. We have ruled from the shadows long enough. No, the voice belonged to a figure Johann had not noticed before, seated in the darkest corner of the room. This one had maintained a more convincing human appearance, but something about the way shadows seemed to bend around him suggested power far beyond the others. The deception serves us well. They believe they choose their rulers, that bloodlines and divine mandate determine succession. They never suspect that we simply inhabit those best suited to our purposes. Johann realized with growing horror that he was witnessing a gathering of beings who had infiltrated the highest levels of European power. These creatures had not merely influenced history, they had directed it, wearing the faces of kings and queens like masks. The French representative, her serpentine hair now clearly visible in the flickering candlelight, spoke with apparent frustration. The cost grows greater each year. Maintaining human form requires considerable energy. And always there is the risk of discovery. The shadow-wrapped figure's laughter held no warmth. Who would believe such a tale? We have spent centuries ensuring that those who might recognize our true nature are dismissed as madmen or heretics. The very concept of our existence has been relegated to folklore and superstition. Johann's mind reeled as the implications became clear. The wars he had recorded, the political marriages he had documented, the rise and fall of dynasties, all of it orchestrated by beings whose agenda remained hidden from humanity. But what were they? And what do they ultimately want? As if responding to his unspoken question, the emperor began to speak of their history. They were old, older than recorded human civilization. They had walked among the first cities of Mesopotamia, had whispered in the ears of Egyptian pharaohs, had guided the expansion of Rome. Humanity, in their view, was a useful species, intelligent enough to build impressive civilizations, yet limited enough to remain manageable. The Chinese dynasties serve us well, the Venetian noted. The mandate of heaven concept makes transitions of power simple to justify when we require new hosts. Yes, but their philosophers grow troublesome, replied another figure whose accent suggested origins in the Germanic regions. This emphasis on natural law and human reason threatens our fundamental premise that authority flows from sources beyond human understanding. The shadow figure raised a hand, and the room fell silent. We adapt as we have always adapted. If they wish to embrace reason, we shall give them reasonable explanations for our rule. If they seek natural law, we shall demonstrate that we represent the natural order, predators and prey, rulers and ruled. Johann began to understand the true scope of their infiltration. These beings had not simply conquered human civilization through force. They had evolved alongside it, learning to manipulate human psychology and social structures with supernatural patience and intelligence. They had become the puppet masters of history itself. The discussion turned to specific regions and time periods. In England, they spoke of having guided the Norman conquest, ensuring that strong, centralized monarchy would serve their purposes. They had influenced the development of feudalism across Europe, creating hierarchical structures that naturally accommodated their form of hidden rule. The Crusades, they revealed with casual indifference, had been orchestrated partly to eliminate certain human bloodlines that showed resistance to their mental influence. The indigenous peoples of the Americas present new challenges, the French representative observed. Their spiritual traditions sometimes allow them to perceive our true nature. The Spanish have been useful in disrupting these traditions, but complete control remains elusive. The emperor nodded gravely. Distance works against us there. Direct possession requires proximity, and the ocean crossing demands that we rely more heavily on human agents. This is why we have encouraged the establishment of colonial governments. They extend our reach without requiring our physical presence. Johann realized he was witnessing the planning of what would become the modern colonial system. These beings were not merely opportunistic parasites. They were master strategists working on timescales that spanned centuries. The conversation shifted to their methods of maintaining control. Physical possession of human rulers was their preferred approach, but it carried risks. The human body could only sustain their presence for limited periods before beginning to deteriorate. This explained the apparent madness that often affected monarchs in their later years. Not the burden of power, but the gradual breakdown caused by hosting an inhuman intelligence. When direct possession proved impossible or impractical, they employed other methods. Certain human bloodlines showed greater susceptibility to their mental influence, which was why royal families had traditionally married within narrow circles. They had also cultivated networks of fully aware human servants, individuals who knowingly served the hidden masters in exchange for power, wealth, or arcane knowledge. The printing press troubles me, admitted the Germanic representative. Information spreads too quickly now. Our ability to control narratives diminishes. Then we must ensure we control the sources, the shadow figure replied smoothly. Libraries, universities, centers of learning. These must be influenced or infiltrated. If we cannot prevent the spread of information, we must control what information spreads. Johann watched in fascination and terror as they outlined plans that would shape the next several centuries. They discussed the establishment of financial institutions that would allow them to control resources without direct political rule. They spoke of encouraging scientific advancement in areas that serve their purposes while suppressing discoveries that might reveal their nature. Most chillingly, they planned to gradually shift human society toward models of governance that would function effectively even without their direct intervention, creating systems so thoroughly designed to concentrate power that they would operate according to their wishes even when staffed entirely by unaware humans. The meeting continued through the darkest hours of the night, revealing the staggering scope of their infiltration. In the Islamic world, they had influenced the development of the Ottoman Empire, ensuring its expansion would create the conflicts and population movements they desired. In Asia, they had guided the isolation policies that would keep potential threats contained within specific regions. In Africa, they had begun the processes that would eventually facilitate the slave trade, not for economic reasons, but to disrupt social structures and create the conditions for easier long-term control. Throughout it all, Johann began to recognize a pattern. These beings were not evil in any human sense. They were apex predators operating according to their nature. They viewed humanity much as humans might view cattle: useful, manageable, worthy of a certain basic care to maintain their utility, but ultimately existing to serve purposes beyond their understanding. As dawn approached, the gathering began to conclude. The representatives made their preparations to depart, each returning to their respective domains to continue the masquerade. But before they dispersed, the shadow figure addressed a concern that had been lurking beneath the entire discussion. "There are signs that others of our kind approach from the distant regions," he announced, his words carrying a weight that silenced all other conversation. Whether they come as allies, competitors, or threats remains unclear. We must be prepared for the possibility that our comfortable arrangement may face challenges from sources we have not anticipated. This revelation added another layer to Johann's growing understanding. These beings were not unique. They were simply the first of their kind to establish dominion over human civilization. Somewhere beyond the known world, others waited, watched, or advanced with their own agendas. The emperor rose from his seat, and, as he did, his human appearance began to reassert itself. The translucent skin grew opaque. The black eyes resumed their normal blue coloration. The inhuman harmonics faded from his voice. Within moments, he appeared once again to be exactly the man Johann had served all these years. "Our scribe awaits," the emperor said, his tone now perfectly matching the familiar voice Johann knew. "Let him record what he has seen, knowing that none will believe him should he speak of it. The beauty of truth that exceeds human comprehension is that it serves as its own concealment." Johann realized with mounting dread that he had been expected, that his presence at this meeting was no accident. As the chamber door opened and he stumbled inside, his hands shaking as he prepared his writing materials, he understood that he was about to become part of their design. The emperor began to dictate what appeared to be routine diplomatic correspondence, letters to other courts discussing trade agreements and territorial boundaries. But Johann now recognized the hidden meanings within the formal language, the coded communications that would coordinate the activities of the network he had just observed. As he wrote, Johann's mind raced with questions about the true history of the world. How many of the great rulers of the past had been what they appeared? Had Alexander truly been a Macedonian king? Or had something else driven his impossible conquests? Were the Roman emperors who claimed divinity perhaps expressing literal truth in ways their subjects could never comprehend? Had Charlemagne's empire expanded through military genius, or through the guidance of inhuman intelligence? The documents he was transcribing would become part of the official imperial records, indistinguishable from countless other pieces of administrative correspondence. Future historians would read them without suspicion, never recognizing that they were examining the communications of beings who had shaped human civilization from its earliest days. When the dictation concluded, the emperor turned to Johann with what appeared to be genuine concern. "You have served us faithfully, Master Kellner. Your discretion has always been exemplary. I trust it will remain so." Johann nodded, understanding that his continued existence depended upon his silence. But as he gathered his materials and prepared to leave, he realized that silence would not be enough. The knowledge he now carried would change everything about how he viewed the world, would make it impossible for him to continue his previous existence as an unaware servant. Over the following months, Johann began to recognize signs he had previously overlooked. Certain nobles who moved through the court displayed subtle characteristics that suggested they might be more than they appeared. Political decisions that had seemed motivated by human concerns now revealed patterns suggesting other influences. The very structure of imperial administration, which he had always attributed to human organizational genius, showed design elements that served purposes beyond human comprehension. He began to research historical records with new eyes, searching for evidence of the infiltration he now knew existed. Ancient texts that had been dismissed as mythology took on new significance. References to divine rulers, to kings who could speak with gods, to dynasties that seemed to possess knowledge beyond their apparent origins. All of these began to suggest a hidden truth that historians had been trained to ignore. Johann's investigation led him to other documents, other records that previous scholars had found too strange or inconvenient to incorporate into accepted historical narratives. He discovered accounts from Byzantine chroniclers who described court officials with supernatural abilities. He found Venetian merchant records that detailed trade negotiations with representatives who seemed never to age. Most disturbing of all, he uncovered church documents that suggested certain high-ranking ecclesiastical figures had been struggling against infiltration by entities whose nature defied theological explanation. The pattern was consistent across cultures and centuries. Wherever human civilization reached sufficient complexity to support centralized government, these beings appeared to guide, influence, or control its development. They showed particular interest in periods of rapid change or expansion, times when human societies were most vulnerable to external direction. Johann began to understand that the Protestant Reformation, which had seemed like a purely human religious movement, might actually represent something more significant. Perhaps some humans were beginning to develop resistance to the subtle mental influences these beings employed. Perhaps the emphasis on individual relationship with the divine, on questioning traditional authority, represented an evolutionary response to centuries of hidden manipulation. This possibility both encouraged and terrified him. If humanity was developing natural defenses against their hidden rulers, it might explain the increasing frequency of meetings like the one he had witnessed. The beings might be facing challenges to their control that required more direct coordination and planning. But Johann also recognized that his own situation had become increasingly precarious. The knowledge he carried made him both valuable and dangerous to the network he had discovered. They might choose to eliminate him, or they might find ways to use his awareness for their own purposes. Either possibility meant that his previous life was effectively over. As winter approached Prague, Johann made his decision. He would continue his research, but he would also begin preparing a record of his discoveries. Not for publication, he was not so naive as to believe such a document could be openly shared, but for preservation. Someone in the future might need to understand what he had learned. He began working on a comprehensive account, hidden within what appeared to be routine historical research. Using his position as imperial scribe, he gained access to archives across the Holy Roman Empire, documenting evidence of the infiltration wherever he could find it. His official duties provided the perfect cover for his investigation, allowing him to travel and examine records without arousing suspicion. Johann's research revealed the staggering scope of the deception. These beings had not merely influenced political development. They had shaped human culture itself. Religious traditions that emphasized unquestioning obedience to authority served their purposes. Educational systems that discouraged speculation about the nature of reality worked in their favor. Even artistic and literary traditions had been guided to reinforce concepts that made their rule seem natural and inevitable. Yet Johann also began to identify sources of resistance. Certain philosophical traditions, particularly those emphasizing direct observation and rational inquiry, seemed to make individuals less susceptible to the mental influences these beings employed. Some religious practices, especially those involving meditation or mystical experience, appeared to enhance human awareness in ways that made the deception more detectable. Most encouragingly, Johann discovered that the being's power was not absolute. They required human cooperation, conscious or unconscious, to maintain their control. Their influence depended heavily on humanity's willingness to accept authority without question, to believe in the naturalness of hierarchy, to assume that those who ruled did so because they were inherently superior. This understanding led Johann to a crucial realization about the nature of the threat these beings represented. They were not invulnerable conquerors who had defeated humanity through superior force. They were parasites whose success depended upon humanity's failure to recognize their presence. Their greatest weapon was not supernatural power, but the simple human tendency to believe what seemed obvious and to dismiss what seemed impossible. The implications were both hopeful and daunting. If enough humans could be made aware of the deception, the hidden ruler's power would begin to erode. But achieving such awareness would require overcoming centuries of conditioning, challenging fundamental assumptions about the nature of authority and power. Johann also recognized that the approaching changes the beings had discussed would likely accelerate the confrontation between their agenda and human awareness. The printing press, the growth of literacy, the development of new philosophical and scientific methods, all of these trends worked against their ability to maintain the deception that had served them so well. As he continued his research through the long winter months, Johann began to understand that he was witnessing a turning point in human history. The comfortable arrangement that had allowed these beings to rule from behind the masks of human authority was beginning to break down. Whether humanity would successfully throw off their hidden masters, or whether the beings would adapt their methods to maintain control, remained to be determined. The spring of 1649 brought news that confirmed Johann's growing sense that momentous changes were approaching. King Charles I of England had been executed, an unprecedented challenge to the divine right of kings. In France, the Fronde Rebellion suggested that even there, traditional authority faced serious challenges. Across Europe, old certainties were dissolving. Johann wondered whether the beings he had observed were successfully adapting to these changes, or whether they were beginning to lose control of the forces they had helped unleash. The execution of a king, even one who may have been under their influence, suggested that human resistance to their authority was growing stronger than they had anticipated. His investigation took on new urgency as he realized that the window for preserving his discoveries might be closing. If the hidden rulers were indeed facing serious challenges to their power, they might soon take more direct action to eliminate threats to their security. A scribe who knew too much might not survive the coming upheavals. Johann made arrangements to secure his research, creating multiple copies hidden in different locations. He also began to identify individuals who might be capable of recognizing and acting upon the truth he had uncovered. Not everyone could be made aware. The knowledge was too dangerous, and most people lacked the intellectual framework necessary to accept such a radical revision of their understanding of reality. But certain scholars, certain philosophers, certain individuals whose work already challenged conventional assumptions about authority and power, these might be capable of receiving and acting upon his discoveries. Johann began the delicate process of making contact, sharing fragments of evidence, testing their readiness to consider possibilities beyond conventional understanding. As summer arrived, Johann's position at court allowed him to observe the increasing strain on the emperor and other officials he suspected of being influenced or controlled by the hidden beings. They appeared more frequently agitated, their human masks slipping more often. Something was clearly disrupting the comfortable arrangement that had prevailed for so many centuries. The answer came during another midnight meeting, this one even more urgent than the first Johann had witnessed. The shadow figure who had dominated the previous gathering now appeared genuinely concerned, his usual confidence replaced by something approaching alarm. "The eastern approaches bring disturbing news," he announced without preamble. "Our distant cousins have indeed begun their advance westward. But they come not as allies seeking cooperation, but as competitors intent upon claiming our territories for themselves. Johann realized that the hidden rulers faced a threat they had not anticipated. Other beings like themselves, perhaps more powerful, certainly more aggressive, approaching from regions beyond European influence. The comfortable world of managed human development was about to face invasion by entities with their own agenda. The discussion that followed revealed the true vulnerability of the beings who had seemed so powerful to Johann's eyes. They had adapted themselves to working within human social structures, had become dependent upon the civilizations they guided. Facing direct confrontation with others of their kind would require abandoning the subtle methods that had served them so well. "We have perhaps 2 decades before they reach the Germanic regions," the emperor stated, his voice carrying harmonics of strain. "If we are to preserve what we have built, we must accelerate our plans significantly." What followed was the outline of a strategy that would transform European civilization over the next several centuries. Unable to maintain their hidden influence in the face of approaching competition, they would instead attempt to create human social systems so thoroughly designed to serve their purposes that they would continue functioning even without direct guidance. The plan was breathtaking in its scope and cynicism. They would encourage the development of financial systems that would concentrate wealth and power regardless of who nominally controlled them. They would promote political philosophies that emphasize the state's authority over individual conscience. Most crucially, they would foster the development of technologies that would make surveillance and control easier while making resistance more difficult. Johann understood that he was witnessing the birth of the modern world, but not as historians would later understand it. The Enlightenment, the Industrial Revolution, the rise of modern government, all of it would be shaped by beings preparing to abandon direct rule in favor of systems designed to function automatically according to their wishes. As the meeting concluded and the participants dispersed to their respective domains, Johann realized that his time for investigation was ending. Soon, the hidden rulers would be too busy with their preparations to maintain the careful deceptions that had allowed him to observe them. More importantly, the approaching crisis would likely result in the elimination of anyone who posed a security risk. Johann spent the remaining months of 1649 completing his record and ensuring its preservation. He created a comprehensive account of everything he had learned, disguised as historical research, but containing enough detail to allow future investigators to understand the true nature of the forces that had shaped human civilization. His final entry, written as winter approached Prague once again, reflected both despair and hope. "They have ruled us not through strength, but through our willingness to be ruled. They have shaped our civilizations not through force, but through our eagerness to build what they desired. Their power over us has always depended upon our ignorance of their existence and our acceptance of their right to guide our destiny. Yet the very success of their rule has created the conditions for their downfall. The civilizations they have fostered have produced human beings capable of recognizing deception, of questioning authority, of imagining alternatives to the world as it appears. The knowledge they have encouraged us to develop includes the tools necessary to perceive their influence and resist their control. The approaching crisis may scatter them, may force them to reveal themselves more clearly, may create opportunities for humanity to break free from their guidance. Whether we seize such opportunities will depend upon our courage to accept truths that challenge our most fundamental assumptions about the nature of our world. Those who come after us must understand that the choice between freedom and servitude is not made once, but renewed in every generation. They must recognize that authority claimed is not authority earned, that power concentrated is power corrupted, and that the price of liberty is not merely vigilance, but the willingness to see clearly even when seeing clearly destroys comfortable illusions. We have been shaped by forces beyond our awareness, but we are not doomed to remain their creatures forever. The future will be determined not by the plans of our hidden masters, but by our choice to claim our rightful heritage as free beings capable of determining our own destiny. Johann sealed his record and made his final arrangements for its preservation. Whether future generations would discover and understand his warning remained to be seen. But he had done what he could to ensure that the truth would survive, waiting for those with the wisdom and courage to recognize it. The hidden rulers who had guided human civilization for millennia would soon face challenges that might finally expose their influence to broader human awareness. What emerged from that confrontation would depend upon humanity's readiness to claim responsibility for its own future. Johann could only hope that his efforts would contribute to that readiness when the time for choosing finally arrived. The winter of 1650 brought more than snow to Prague. It brought the first refugees from the Eastern Territories, speaking in hushed tones of armies that moved without sound, of conquests that left no trace except the strange behavior of those who had witnessed them. Johann recognized the signs immediately. The approaching forces the shadow figure had warned about were closer than anyone had anticipated. Through his position at court, Johann watched as the hidden ruler's carefully maintained composure began to crack. Emperor Ferdinand III increasingly displayed the inhuman characteristics Johann had observed during that first midnight meeting. The emperor's human mask was failing under the stress of the approaching crisis, and Johann wondered how long it would be before others at court began to notice the changes. The answer came sooner than expected. During a routine audience with visiting diplomats, the emperor's eyes briefly shifted to the solid black Johann remembered from the secret gathering. A young Bavarian courier stumbled backward, his face pale with terror, pointing at the emperor while stammering incomprehensibly about demons and witchcraft. The response was swift and revealing. Before Johann could even process what was happening, the courier had collapsed, his eyes rolling back to show only whites. When he revived minutes later, he remembered nothing of what he had seen, speaking only of being overcome by the honor of the imperial presence. Johann realized he had witnessed their method of dealing with unwanted exposure. These beings possessed the ability to alter human memory directly, erasing inconvenient observations before they could spread. This explained how they had maintained their deception for so long. Not only did they hide their true nature, they could make humans forget when the disguise slipped. But the incident also revealed the strain they were under. The memory alteration had been crude, obvious to anyone who knew what to look for. In their haste to contain the exposure, they had demonstrated another of their abilities while failing to fully mask the intervention. Johann began to suspect that their powers were diminishing, that the approaching threat was somehow weakening their hold on both their human masks and their mental influence. His suspicions were confirmed when he intercepted a coded message intended for the Venetian representative. Using techniques he had developed during his months of investigation, Johann deciphered a communication that revealed the true scope of the crisis facing the hidden rulers. The approaching entities were not simply competitors for territory. They were a different species entirely, one that had evolved along a separate path. Where Johann's hidden rulers had learned to work within human social structures, these newcomers had developed methods of direct domination that made such subtlety unnecessary. They could control human minds completely, turning entire populations into willing slaves without any need for the elaborate deceptions that had characterized European rule. More troubling still, these approaching beings seemed immune to the mental influences that Johann's hidden rulers employed. The comfortable arrangement of mutual non-interference that had allowed different groups of entities to carve up the world into spheres of influence was ending. The newcomers intended to claim everything, and they possessed the power to make their intentions reality. Johann realized that humanity was about to become the battlefield in a war between different species of supernatural beings. The hidden rulers who had guided European civilization were now fighting for their own survival, and their human subjects had become simultaneously weapons, shields, and prizes in a conflict that would determine the future of both species. The implications were staggering. If the hidden rulers lost, humanity would face complete enslavement to beings who saw no value in maintaining even the pretense of human agency. If they won, The cost of victory might require them to abandon their subtle methods in favor of the direct control they had always eschewed, fundamentally altering the nature of human civilization. But Johann also began to recognize a third possibility, one that neither group of entities seemed to have considered. The conflict between them might create opportunities for humanity to break free from both forms of domination, to claim genuine independence for the first time in recorded history. This possibility became more real as Johann observed the changes taking place across Europe. The hidden ruler's weakening grip on power was creating space for genuinely human developments. The growth of scientific inquiry, the emergence of philosophical systems based on human reason, the development of political theories that emphasized individual rights. All of these trends represented authentic human evolution, unguided by their supernatural masters. Johann began to see the Protestant Reformation in a new light. Perhaps it represented not just religious reform, but humanity's first successful resistance to supernatural manipulation. The emphasis on individual conscience over institutional authority, the insistence on direct relationship with the divine rather than mediated access through hierarchies. These concepts challenged the fundamental assumptions upon which the hidden ruler's power rested. He started investigating the backgrounds of prominent Reformation leaders, searching for evidence that they had somehow perceived the true nature of the authority they challenged. What he discovered was both encouraging and disturbing. Several key figures had indeed demonstrated awareness of supernatural influences in human affairs, but their attempts to expose such influences had been systematically suppressed or reinterpreted as purely religious concerns. Martin Luther's writings, when examined carefully, contained references to earthly powers that served in human masters. But these passages had been edited in later editions, their true meaning obscured by theological interpretations that made them seem metaphorical rather than literal. Similar patterns appeared in the works of other reformers. Initial clarity about the supernatural nature of certain authorities, followed by revision and reinterpretation that rendered their warnings harmless. Johann realized that the hidden rulers had been more active in managing human intellectual development than he had initially understood. They had not simply influenced political and social structures. They had carefully controlled the development of ideas themselves, ensuring that human understanding remained within safe boundaries, even when it challenged their direct authority. Yet their control was not complete. Johann discovered underground networks of scholars and philosophers who had maintained more accurate understanding of humanity's true situation. These groups had preserved ancient knowledge about the supernatural entities that influenced human affairs, passing such information through carefully concealed traditions that had survived centuries of suppression. Through these networks, Johann learned that the current crisis was not unique in human history. Similar confrontations had occurred before, usually resulting in massive disruptions that historical records had attributed to natural disasters, plagues, or political upheavals. The fall of the Western Roman Empire, the collapse of various Chinese dynasties, the mysterious disappearance of advanced civilizations in the Americas. Many of these events might actually have resulted from conflicts between different groups of supernatural entities competing for control over human populations. This historical perspective offered both hope and warning. Previous conflicts had sometimes resulted in periods of reduced supernatural influence, allowing human civilizations to develop more independently. But they had also frequently led to dark ages in which human progress stagnated while the entities re-established control through new methods and different power structures. Johann began to understand that humanity's response to the current crisis would be crucial in determining which pattern would repeat. If humans remained passive observers of a conflict between their masters, they would likely find themselves subjected to whichever form of supernatural rule emerged victorious. But if they could recognize the opportunity presented by their master's distraction and vulnerability, they might achieve something unprecedented in human history: genuine freedom from supernatural domination. This realization led Johann to expand his activities beyond mere investigation and documentation. He began reaching out to the underground networks he had discovered, sharing his insights about the approaching crisis and advocating for coordinated human action to exploit the opportunity it presented. The response was mixed but encouraging. Some network members had already recognized the signs of the coming conflict and were preparing for various contingencies. Others were so accustomed to supernatural domination that they could not envision genuine human independence as a realistic possibility. But a growing number were willing to consider that the time might have come for humanity to claim its rightful place as the dominant species on its own planet. Johann found himself at the center of planning for what the networks euphemistically called the Great Liberation. The goal was not to choose sides in the conflict between different supernatural entities, but to position humanity to assert its independence regardless of who emerged victorious from their struggle. The plan required careful coordination across multiple domains. Scientific and philosophical developments would need to be accelerated to provide humans with better understanding of the forces they faced. Political and social movements would need to be guided to challenge supernatural influence without revealing awareness of its existence. Most crucially, key individuals in positions of power would need to be identified and either awakened to the true situation or replaced with those who could act in humanity's genuine interests. Johann's role in this effort was to monitor the hidden rulers' activities and provide intelligence about their plans and vulnerabilities. His position at court gave him unique access to information that could prove crucial in the coming struggle. But it also placed him in extraordinary danger as the entity's desperation made them increasingly willing to take risks with their human agents. The spring of 1651 brought the first direct evidence that the approaching forces had reached European territories. Strange reports began filtering in from the eastern borders. Entire villages whose populations had suddenly changed their behavior overnight, becoming unnaturally cooperative and productive while showing no signs of independent thought or emotion. These communities functioned with mechanical efficiency, but their inhabitants seemed to have lost something essential to human nature. Johann realized he was observing the newcomers' method of control in action. Unlike the hidden rulers who worked through existing power structures and human psychology, these beings simply overwrote human consciousness entirely, creating populations of perfectly obedient servants who retained their technical skills while losing all capacity for independent action. The horror of this fate galvanized the resistance networks into more urgent action. Whatever flaws the hidden ruler's system might have had, it at least preserved some semblance of human agency. The alternative being demonstrated on the eastern borders represented complete extinction of human consciousness, leaving only empty shells animated by alien will. Johann watched as his hidden rulers struggled to respond to this threat. Their traditional methods proved useless against beings who could simply ignore psychological manipulation and political maneuvering. Attempts to negotiate were met with demands for complete surrender. Military resistance was rendered impossible when enemy forces could convert defending armies into allies simply by approaching close enough to exert their influence. The shadow figure who had dominated the earlier meetings appeared increasingly desperate as the crisis deepened. During a gathering in late spring, Johann observed him proposing strategies that would have been unthinkable under normal circumstances. "We must abandon the masquerade entirely," the shadow figure declared, his usual composure replaced by barely controlled panic. "Direct rule, open supernatural authority, complete integration of human and entity governance. It is the only way to mobilize sufficient resistance to halt their advance." The response from other representatives was immediate and negative. Abandoning their subtle methods would not only reveal their existence to humanity, but would also eliminate most of the advantages that had made their rule successful. Humans who knew they were being ruled by supernatural entities might prove more difficult to govern than those who believed their rulers were legitimately human. The risk of human rebellion becomes insignificant compared to the certainty of extinction if we fail to stop the eastern advance, the shadow figure insisted. We can deal with human resistance after we have secured our survival. Johann realized that the hidden rulers were considering a strategy that would fundamentally alter human civilization regardless of whether it succeeded in stopping the approaching threat. Open supernatural rule would end the illusion of human self-governance forever, even if it preserved human consciousness from the complete obliteration threatened by their enemies. This prospect added new urgency to the Liberation Network's planning. If either supernatural faction achieved complete victory, humanity's window for independence would close permanently. The time for action was approaching more rapidly than anyone had anticipated. Johann began receiving instructions for his role in the coming effort. When the moment arrived, and the signs suggested it would be soon, he was to use his access to imperial documents to facilitate a coordinated revelation of the hidden ruler's true nature. Simultaneously, operatives in other courts across Europe would expose their own supernatural infiltrators, creating a continent-wide awakening that would make continued deception impossible. The goal was not to destroy the entities immediately. That was likely beyond human capability, but to break their control over human institutions and force them into the open where they could be confronted directly. Once humans understood the true nature of their situation, they could begin developing methods of resistance based on accurate knowledge rather than superstition and folklore. The plan carried enormous risks. The hidden ruler's response to exposure might be violent, potentially resulting in massive casualties as they abandoned subtle control for direct coercion. The approaching Eastern forces might exploit the chaos to accelerate their advance, catching humanity in a moment of maximum vulnerability. Even success might lead to social collapse, as human institutions built around supernatural manipulation proved unable to function independently. But Johann and his fellow conspirators had concluded that these risks were acceptable compared to the certainty of permanent enslavement under either form of supernatural rule. Humanity had been shaped and guided by inhuman intelligence for millennia, but it retained the potential for independent development if given the opportunity to exercise it. The summer of 1651 would determine whether that opportunity could be claimed or whether humanity's brief moment of potential freedom would pass unutilized, leaving future generations to face an even more complete form of domination than their ancestors had endured. As Johann prepared for his role in the Great Revelation, he reflected on the strange journey that had brought him from faithful imperial scribe to revolutionary conspirator against supernatural authority. The knowledge that had seemed so dangerous when first acquired had become the foundation for hope that humanity might finally claim its rightful place as the master of its own destiny. The outcome remained uncertain, but for the first time in recorded history, humans would face their supernatural rulers with full knowledge of what they truly were. That knowledge alone might prove to be the most powerful weapon humanity had ever possessed in its long struggle for genuine freedom. The approaching conflict would test whether human courage, ingenuity, and determination could overcome millennia of conditioning and manipulation. Johann could only hope that his species was ready for the challenge that awaited them. The signal came on the feast day of St. John the Baptist, June 24th, 1651. A simple message delivered by a merchant who traded in rare books. The printing press runs tonight. Across Europe, similar coded communications reached members of the Liberation Networks, setting in motion the most audacious plan in human history. Johann spent the morning of June 25th performing his usual duties, transcribing routine correspondence, and maintaining the careful facade that had protected him for so long. But as evening approached, he made his way to the imperial archives carrying materials that would transform the nature of human understanding forever. The documents he had prepared over months of careful work were masterpieces of revelation disguised as historical research. Each appeared to be a scholarly examination of medieval court records, but together they contained irrefutable evidence of supernatural infiltration spanning centuries. Names, dates, specific incidents, genealogical charts showing impossible lineages, financial records documenting resources that could not have existed within human economic systems. Everything needed to prove that European nobility had been systematically replaced or controlled by inhuman entities. As midnight approached, Johann began the delicate process of introducing these documents into the official imperial records. His years of service had given him intimate knowledge of the archive system, allowing him to place the revelatory materials where they would be discovered by mourning clerks conducting routine business. The documents would appear to be long overlooked historical records, their explosive contents emerging through normal scholarly investigation rather than deliberate exposure. Simultaneously, across the continent, Johann's counterparts were implementing similar strategies. In Paris, a clerk in the Royal Library was cataloging manuscripts that would reveal the true nature of the French court's inhuman influences. In Venice, a merchant was distributing pamphlets disguised as commercial documents that contained coded references to supernatural control of Mediterranean trade routes. In London, scholars were preparing to present evidence that would fundamentally alter understanding of the English Civil War's true causes. The plan required precise timing to prevent the hidden rulers from coordinating a response before the revelations could spread. By dawn, evidence of their nature would be emerging simultaneously across dozens of major population centers, creating a revelation too widespread and diverse to suppress through their usual methods. Johann completed his work just as the cathedral bells announced the first hour after midnight. As he prepared to leave the archives, he heard sounds that confirmed his worst fears about the risks they were taking. Heavy footsteps in the corridors above, voices speaking in the inhuman harmonics he had learned to recognize, and underneath it all, a low vibration that seemed to emanate from the stones themselves. The hidden rulers had detected that something was wrong. Whether through supernatural senses or simply the disruption caused by coordinated human action across their network, they were responding to the threat more quickly than the liberation planners had anticipated. Johann pressed himself against the archive wall as the footsteps approached his location. Through a gap in the shelving, he observed Emperor Ferdinand III moving through the corridor with several companions Johann did not recognize. But these were clearly not human. They moved with a fluid grace that defied normal anatomy, their forms shifting slightly in the torchlight as if their physical appearance required constant conscious maintenance. The eastern borders report accelerated advancement. One of them was saying, its voice carrying harmonics that made Johann's teeth ache. They have detected the disturbance in our network and are exploiting it immediately. The Emperor's response revealed the full scope of the crisis now facing the hidden rulers. Then, we abandoned the conservation protocols entirely. Full revelation, immediate assertion of direct control, mobilization of all human resources for the conflict ahead. The masquerade has served its purpose, but survival requires adaptation. Johann realized with a mixture of terror and exhilaration that the liberation plan had succeeded beyond their most optimistic projections. The hidden rulers were not merely being exposed. They were being forced to abandon their entire approach to governing human civilization. The careful system of influence and manipulation that had guided European development for centuries was ending not gradually, but immediately. What followed would determine whether humanity gained its freedom or faced open supernatural tyranny. But either outcome would be preferable to the continued deception that had characterized their previous existence. The entities continued their discussion as they moved past Johann's hiding place, revealing details about their true nature that even his extensive investigation had not uncovered. They spoke of cycles of renewal that occurred every several millennia, of the approaching forces as members of a rival hive mind that had originated in the Asian steppes before beginning its westward expansion, of their own species' evolution from entities that had once served as intermediaries between early human civilizations and cosmic forces beyond terrestrial comprehension. Most revelatory was their discussion of humanity's role in the coming conflict. The hidden rulers had not simply been exploiting human civilization. They had been preparing it for this exact crisis. Every technological advancement they had encouraged, every social structure they had influenced, every cultural development they had guided had been designed to create human populations capable of serving as effective allies in supernatural warfare. The universities, the printing presses, the development of modern military techniques, even the religious reforms that emphasized individual conscience. All of it had been shaped to produce humans who could think independently enough to be useful allies, while remaining controllable enough to serve supernatural masters. Johann understood with growing amazement that humanity had been transformed over centuries into a weapon designed for use in conflicts between supernatural entities. The liberation networks had not simply stumbled upon an opportunity for freedom. They've been unconsciously fulfilling their intended purpose by developing the capacity for organized resistance to supernatural authority. This realization changed everything about the nature of the choice humanity faced. They were not choosing between freedom and slavery, but between serving as conscious allies in a supernatural conflict or remaining unconscious tools of entities whose agenda might not serve human interests. As the entities moved away from the archives, Johann made his decision. He would complete his original mission of spreading the revelatory documents, but he would also add new materials based on what he had just learned. Humanity deserved to understand not only that they had been ruled by supernatural entities, but also why they had been shaped in the ways they had experienced. Working quickly, Johann prepared additional documents that outlined the true purpose behind the developments of recent centuries. These materials revealed the hidden ruler's long-term strategy for preparing human civilization to serve their needs in exactly the kind of crisis they now faced. But Johann also included his own analysis of the opportunities this situation presented. If humanity had indeed been transformed into a species capable of effective resistance to supernatural authority, they possessed capabilities their hidden masters might not fully understand. The same independence of thought that made humans useful allies might also make them capable of claiming genuine autonomy. As dawn approached Prague, Johann could hear increasing activity throughout the castle. The hidden rulers were beginning their transition from subtle influence to direct control, and the sound suggested that the process was neither smooth nor completely successful. Human voices could be heard expressing confusion, fear, and, in some cases, open rebellion against orders that no longer pretended to come from legitimate human authority. Johann completed his work and began making his way out of the castle through routes he had carefully planned during his months of preparation. But, as he approached the main courtyard, he encountered evidence that the revelation was already having effects beyond anything the liberation networks had anticipated. Groups of castle guards and servants were gathered in heated discussion, comparing strange experiences they had been having over recent months. Several reported dreams in which their usual duties had been interrupted by visions of inhuman entities giving them orders. Others described feeling compelled to actions they could not remember choosing to perform. A few spoke of moments when familiar officials had briefly appeared to be something other than human. Johann realized that the hidden ruler's abandonment of their subtle methods had eliminated the mental controls that had prevented humans from remembering supernatural influences on their behavior. Across the castle, and presumably throughout Prague and beyond, people were beginning to recall experiences that had previously been hidden from their conscious awareness. The revelation was not merely exposing current supernatural influence. It was allowing humans to understand the full extent to which their lives have been shaped by inhuman direction. The psychological impact would be profound, potentially destabilizing human society even without direct action from either supernatural faction. Johann made his way through the city streets as the sun rose higher, observing the early stages of what would become the greatest transformation in human consciousness since the development of civilization itself. Small groups gathered around individuals reading from hastily printed broadsheets that contained excerpts from the revelatory documents now emerging from archives across the continent. The reactions ranged from disbelief to terror to rage, but Underlying all of them was a growing recognition that the fundamental assumptions about human society and authority were being overturned. By mid-morning, Johann reached the safe house where members of his liberation network were gathering to coordinate their response to the rapidly evolving situation. What he found there was both encouraging and deeply concerning. The revelations were succeeding beyond their most optimistic projections. Evidence of supernatural infiltration was being confirmed in dozens of major cities across Europe. Human populations were responding with surprising speed and organization to the news that their rulers had been replaced or controlled by inhuman entities. Resistance groups were forming spontaneously, drawing on pre-existing networks of scholars, merchants, craftsmen, and even some members of the lower nobility who had always sensed something wrong with the established order. But the response from the supernatural entities was also more severe than anticipated. Reports were arriving of open conflict between humans and entities who had abandoned their human disguises entirely. In some regions, the hidden rulers were attempting to maintain control through direct coercion, using abilities that had previously been concealed to force human compliance. In others, they seemed to be withdrawing entirely, leaving human institutions to collapse without their guiding influence. Most troubling were reports from the Eastern Territories, where the approaching entities were exploiting the chaos to accelerate their advance. Towns that had been gradually converted to their form of control were now serving as staging areas for rapid expansion westward. The revelation that had been intended to free humanity from supernatural control was instead facilitating a more complete and brutal form of supernatural domination. Johann found himself appointed to coordinate intelligence gathering about both supernatural factions' activities. His extensive knowledge of the hidden rulers' methods and his access to imperial records made him uniquely qualified to interpret the conflicting reports flowing in from across the continent. What emerged from his analysis was a picture of supernatural conflict unlike anything in recorded human history. The hidden rulers were fighting desperately to maintain territories they had controlled for centuries, but their reliance on subtle methods had left them unprepared for direct confrontation with entities who had evolved different approaches to power. The approaching Eastern entities possessed abilities that seemed to transcend individual consciousness entirely. They could coordinate their actions across vast distances without any apparent communication, suggesting some form of collective intelligence that the hidden rulers could not match. Their method of controlling human populations was also more efficient. Instead of working through existing social structures, they simply overwrote human consciousness entirely, creating perfect unity of purpose among their subjects. But Johann also began to identify weaknesses in both supernatural factions that the liberation networks might be able to exploit. The hidden rulers' power seemed to depend heavily on human cooperation, even when that cooperation was obtained through deception or coercion. Their abilities were diminished when humans actively resisted their influence, which explained their historical preference for subtle manipulation over direct control. The Eastern entities, despite their apparent advantages, showed signs of being less adaptable than their Western counterparts. Their methods of control were more complete, but also more rigid, leaving little room for the kind of creative problem-solving that had allowed the hidden rulers to guide human civilizations through centuries of change and development. Johann began to envision strategies that could exploit these weaknesses to humanity's advantage. If humans could develop methods of resistance that worked against both forms of supernatural control, they might be able to claim genuine independence while the entities were distracted by their conflict with each other. The key would be understanding the mechanisms by which supernatural entities influenced human consciousness. Johann's research had revealed that their abilities were not unlimited. They required proximity, they were affected by certain mental states and practices, and they seemed to be weakened when humans possessed accurate knowledge about their nature and methods. This suggested that the revelation itself might be providing humanity with its most powerful weapon against supernatural control. Every human who understood the true nature of their situation became harder to manipulate, more resistant to influence, and more capable of independent action. Johann began working with other network leaders to develop training programs that would help humans maximize their resistance to supernatural influence. These programs drew on religious and philosophical traditions that had always emphasized mental discipline, individual conscience, and direct spiritual experience over institutional authority. The goal was not to eliminate supernatural entities immediately. That was likely beyond human capability, but to create human populations so resistant to supernatural control that the entities would be forced to seek other territories or alternative relationships with humanity based on genuine cooperation rather than domination. As summer progressed, the results of these efforts began to show promise. Communities that implemented the resistance training reported success in maintaining their independence, even when approached by entities from either faction. Human institutions began developing new forms of organization based on principles that inherently resisted supernatural manipulation. Most encouragingly, reports began arriving of successful negotiations between human communities and individual entities who were willing to abandon their attempts at domination in exchange for cooperative relationships that served mutual interests. Johann realized that humanity was not simply choosing between different forms of supernatural rule, but was beginning to define entirely new relationships between human and non-human intelligence that respected the autonomy and dignity of both species. The conflict between the supernatural factions continued to rage across Eastern Europe, but in the West, a different kind of society was beginning to emerge. Human communities that had freed themselves from supernatural control were developing governmental systems, economic relationships, and cultural practices that reflected genuinely human values and priorities. These developments were not without challenges. Human societies that have been shaped by supernatural guidance for millennia sometimes struggled to function independently. Some communities descended into chaos when left without the organizing influence they had never realized they possessed. Others developed new forms of tyranny as ambitious humans attempted to claim the authority their supernatural masters had abandoned. But many human communities proved remarkably capable of governing themselves once they understood the true nature of the choice they faced. The same capacities for independent thought and moral reasoning that had made them useful to their supernatural masters also made them capable of creating just and prosperous societies based on human values. Johann watched these developments with a mixture of pride and apprehension. Humanity was proving capable of claiming its independence, but the ultimate outcome of the supernatural conflict remained uncertain. If either faction achieved decisive victory, they might return to claim dominion over human territories that had freed themselves during the chaos of warfare. The approaching winter of 1651 would test whether humanity's newfound freedom could survive the resolution of the conflict that had made it possible. Johann could only hope that the species he had devoted his life to serving would prove worthy of the opportunity that had been placed before them.